Marcus Thompson had served in the British Royal Guard for 8 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to face. Standing at the gates of the Israeli Defense Forces training facility in the Negev desert, sweat already beading on his forehead from the intense Middle Eastern sun, he wondered if accepting this invitation had been a mistake. The invitation had arrived 3 months earlier, delivered through official diplomatic channels. The IDF was hosting an international military exchange program, inviting elite soldiers from allied nations to participate in their most challenging combat training exercises. When Marcus's commanding officer called him into his office that cold February morning in London, he knew something unusual was happening. "Thompson, you've been selected for something special," Colonel Richardson had said, sliding a thick envelope across his mahogany desk. "The Israelis want to test their training methods against some of our best. They specifically requested someone from the Royal Guard with your particular skill set." Marcus had earned his reputation through years of dedicated service. At 28, he was already considered one of the most capable soldiers in his unit. His marksmanship scores were consistently perfect, his physical fitness assessments always maxed out, and his tactical thinking had impressed even the most seasoned officers. But the IDF challenge would test everything he thought he knew about military excellence. The Israeli facility sprawled across hundreds of acres of desert landscape, with modern training buildings rising from the sand like mirages. As Marcus walked through the main entrance, he was greeted by Captain Sarah Cohen, a compact woman with sharp eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of combat experience. "Welcome to our home," she said, in accented but perfect English. "I hope you're ready for what we have planned. Our instructors have designed something special for visiting soldiers who think they know what real training looks like." The first thing that struck Marcus was the intensity of the atmosphere. Even during what appeared to be routine exercises, every Israeli soldier moved with purpose and precision that seemed almost supernatural. Their equipment was well maintained but clearly used hard, bearing the marks of countless training sessions and real-world deployments. Captain Cohen led him to a briefing room where 3 other international soldiers were already seated. There was Ahmed from the Jordanian Special Forces, a quiet man with observant eyes who nodded politely. Next to him sat Lieutenant Sarah from the Canadian Armed Forces, her confident posture suggesting she was used to proving herself in male-dominated environments. The 4th member of their group was Hans from the German Bundeswehr, whose massive frame and methodical movements reminded Marcus of a precision machine. Over the next 5 days, Captain Cohen began, projecting a map onto the wall. "You will participate in exercises designed to push you beyond your current limits. We're not trying to break you down to build you back up. We're trying to show you what you're truly capable of when everything you think you know gets stripped away." The map showed various locations throughout the training facility, each marked with cryptic symbols that meant nothing to Marcus but seemed ominous nonetheless. Desert terrain, urban warfare scenarios, underground tunnel systems, and something labeled simply as the box that made several of the Israeli observers exchange meaningful glances. "Your first challenge begins at 0400 tomorrow," Captain Cohen continued. "You'll be given basic equipment and a simple mission. Reach the extraction point 12 kilometers away before sunrise. Sounds easy enough, right?" The way she said it made Marcus's stomach tighten. Nothing about this place suggested anything would be easy. As they were dismissed to their quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being evaluated in ways he couldn't yet understand. That evening, Marcus sat in the small but comfortable room assigned to him, cleaning his rifle and preparing his gear. Through his window, he could see Israeli soldiers conducting night training exercises, their movements fluid and confident even in complete darkness. The sound of helicopters periodically broke the desert silence, reminding him that this was a facility where real warriors prepared for real battles. His phone buzzed with a message from his fiancée Emma back in London. "How's the desert treating you? Hope you're not getting too sunburned." Her cheerful words felt like they came from another world entirely. Marcus typed back a brief response, not sure how to explain the atmosphere of controlled intensity that surrounded him. As he lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Marcus reflected on what had brought him here. Growing up in Manchester, he had always been drawn to structure and challenge. The military had given him both, along with a sense of purpose he had never found elsewhere. But something about this place felt different from anything he had experienced. The Royal Guard was prestigious, certainly, but their duties were largely ceremonial with occasional security responsibilities. Even his deployment to Afghanistan, 2 years earlier, had been relatively quiet, more about maintaining presence than engaging in serious combat. Here in the Israeli desert, surrounded by soldiers who lived with the constant reality of potential conflict, Marcus felt like he was about to discover what he was really made of. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of training exercises that seemed to continue throughout the night. At 03:30, his alarm buzzed unnecessarily. He had been lying awake for the past hour, nervous energy coursing through his system like electricity. As he dressed in the standard olive-drab uniform provided by his hosts, Marcus caught his reflection in the small mirror above his sink. The man looking back at him appeared confident and capable, but there was uncertainty in his eyes that he had not seen there before. In a few hours, that uncertainty would either be replaced by the satisfaction of meeting an incredible challenge, or by the humbling realization that he had much more to learn about what it meant to be a truly elite soldier. Outside his window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern horizon, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters warming up their engines. The first rays of sunlight painted the desert in shades of gold and orange as Marcus stood with the other international soldiers at the starting point. Captain Cohen and 2 other Israeli instructors faced them, their expressions unreadable in the dim morning light. The simplicity of the briefing had not prepared Marcus for what he now saw laid out before them. 12 kilometers to the extraction point, Instructor Levy announced, his weathered face showing the marks of decades under the desert sun. You have until sunrise, which gives you approximately 90 minutes. The route is your choice, but be aware that the terrain has been prepared with various obstacles you might encounter in real combat situations. Marcus studied the map one final time, noting the contour lines that indicated steep ravines, areas marked as potential ambush sites, and several locations simply labeled as hazards. The straight-line distance to their objective was indeed 12 kilometers, but the terrain made a direct route nearly impossible. Ahmed, the Jordanian soldier, was the first to move out, choosing a path that skirted the northern edge of the training area. His knowledge of desert warfare was immediately apparent as he moved with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who understood how to conserve energy in harsh conditions. Hans followed shortly after, taking a more direct but challenging route through what the map indicated was rough terrain. Lieutenant Sarah from Canada studied the map for another 30 seconds before choosing a southern route that appeared longer, but potentially easier. As she disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus realized he was overthinking the situation. Every moment spent analyzing was a moment lost, and in military operations, hesitation could mean the difference between success and failure. He chose a middle path, one that balanced distance with apparent difficulty, and began jogging at a sustainable pace. The desert air was still cool from the night, but Marcus knew that within hours it would become nearly unbearable. His Royal Guard training had included desert survival courses, but those had been conducted in the relatively mild climate of training facilities in Cyprus. This was different entirely. The first obstacle appeared after only 2 kilometers of travel. What had seemed like flat terrain on the map revealed itself as a series of deep wadis, dry creek beds that cut through the landscape, like scars. Marcus approached the edge of the first one and immediately understood why this route had been marked as moderately difficult. The wadi was perhaps 15 meters deep and 30 meters wide, with steep sides that would require careful navigation. As he picked his way down the rocky slope, his boots dislodging small avalanches of stones, Marcus heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Looking up, he caught a glimpse of an aircraft circling overhead, undoubtedly monitoring the progress of all 4 international soldiers. At the bottom of the wadi, Marcus discovered the first real surprise of the exercise. What appeared to be discarded equipment was scattered across the creek bed. Helmets, ammunition boxes, even what looked like radio equipment. His military training immediately kicked in, warning him that in real combat situations such equipment could be booby-trapped or might indicate the presence of enemy forces. Moving carefully among the debris, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the helmets bore impact marks that looked disturbingly realistic, and dark stains on the rocks nearby could have been dried blood. The Israeli instructors were clearly masters at creating psychological pressure, along with physical challenges. As he climbed out of the wadi on the far side, Marcus checked his watch and realized that 25 minutes had already passed. And pace had been slower than anticipated, and the extraction point still lay more than 8 kilometers away. The sun was rising higher now, and the temperature was beginning to climb noticeably. The next section of his chosen route led through what the map had indicated as mixed terrain, which turned out to be a masterpiece of training course design. Natural desert landscape had been modified with artificial obstacles that perfectly mimicked real-world combat conditions. Concrete barriers created choke points where an enemy could establish ambushes. Abandoned vehicles were positioned to provide cover but also to channel movement in predictable directions. Moving through this area, Marcus began to understand the sophistication of Israeli military training. Every element seemed designed to test not just physical capability, but tactical thinking under pressure. The obstacles weren't just things to overcome, they were problems to solve while maintaining forward momentum toward an objective. Halfway through the mixed terrain section, Marcus heard gunfire in the distance, not the sharp crack of live ammunition, but the distinctive pop of training rounds. Someone was engaging targets, or perhaps being engaged by instructors playing the role of enemy forces. The sound added another layer of stress to an already challenging exercise. As Marcus crested a small hill, he caught sight of Hans in the distance. The German soldier appeared to be pinned down behind a concrete barrier, and several figures in different uniforms were maneuvering toward his position. Marcus realized that the exercise had evolved beyond simple navigation. They were now dealing with simulated combat encounters. His own route seemed clear of immediate threats, but Marcus knew that could change instantly. Military exercises often included curveballs designed to test adaptability and decision-making under pressure. As he moved through a narrow passage between two rocky outcroppings, his suspicions proved correct. The passage opened into a small clearing where 3 Israeli soldiers in different uniforms waited. They were armed with training weapons and wore the distinctive armbands that identified them as opposing force personnel. The scenario was clear. Marcus had walked into an ambush. "Drop your weapon and surrender," the lead instructor called out in English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Marcus's mind raced through his options. In a real combat situation, he would attempt to fight his way out or find alternative routes. But this was a training exercise with specific objectives and rules of engagement that he didn't fully understand. Making the wrong choice could result in immediate failure and elimination from the program. Instead of surrendering or fighting, Marcus chose a third option that drew on his Royal Guard training in crowd control and de-escalation. He raised his hands but continued speaking, trying to gather intelligence about the scenario while buying time to assess his tactical situation. "What are your terms for surrender?" he asked, slowly moving to a position that would give him better cover if the situation turned kinetic. The lead instructor smiled, clearly approving of Marcus's approach. "Smart thinking, Royal Guard. You're not just reacting, you're trying to understand the game, but understanding won't get you to that extraction point before the sun finishes rising." Looking at his watch, Marcus realized that more than an hour had passed, and sunrise was approaching rapidly. The extraction point still lay several kilometers away, and now he was dealing with an active tactical situation that could delay him further or end his participation entirely. The tension in the small clearing was thick as desert air. Marcus found himself in a situation that no amount of Royal Guard training had specifically prepared him for. The 3 Israeli instructors maintained their positions, weapons trained, on him. But there was something in their posture that suggested they were waiting to see how he would respond, rather than simply capturing him. Drawing on his experience from crowd control situations outside Buckingham Palace, Marcus began to understand that this was as much a test of mental agility as physical capability. The instructors weren't just playing enemy soldiers, they were evaluating how he processed unexpected tactical situations under extreme time pressure. "I need to reach that extraction point," Marcus said, lowering his hands slightly but keeping them visible. "What would it take for you to let me continue?" The lead instructor exchanged glances with his colleagues, and Marcus caught a slight nod between them. "Interesting approach, British soldier. In real combat, negotiation isn't usually an option. But this isn't real combat, is it?" "No, sir. It's training designed to push limits and test capabilities," Marcus replied, taking a calculated risk by stepping slightly forward. "And I'm guessing that means there's more than one way to succeed in this scenario." The instructor's smile broadened. "You're thinking like a soldier instead of just reacting like one. Very good. Here's your choice. You can surrender now and be processed as a prisoner, which means automatic failure of this exercise. Or you can attempt to continue your mission, knowing that we'll be pursuing you for the remainder of the course." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'll continue the mission, sir." "Excellent. You have a 30-second head start. Use it wisely." Marcus was already moving before the instructor finished speaking, sprinting toward the far end of the clearing where a gap between two large boulders offered the only apparent exit. Behind him, he heard the instructors beginning to coordinate their pursuit, their voices calm and professional as they discussed tactics for tracking and intercepting him. The gap between the boulders was narrower than it had appeared from a distance, forcing Marcus to squeeze through sideways while maintaining his grip on his rifle. As he emerged on the other side, he found himself on a steep slope leading down into another wadi, this one deeper and more complex than the previous ones he had encountered. The sound of pursuit was already audible behind him, but Marcus resisted the urge to look back. Every second spent checking on his pursuers was time lost in reaching his objective. The extraction point was still more than 5 kilometers away, and sunrise was approaching with the relentless inevitability of desert dawn. Sliding down the slope in a controlled fall, Marcus used rocks and scrub vegetation to manage his descent, while maintaining maximum speed. His Royal Guard fitness training served him well here. Years of ceremonial duties requiring hours of standing at attention had built the kind of core strength and balance that proved invaluable in rough terrain. At the bottom of the wadi, Marcus faced another tactical decision. The dry creek bed extended in both directions, offering concealed movement but potentially leading him away from his objective. Above ground, the terrain was more direct but completely exposed to observation and potential ambush. Checking his compass quickly, Marcus chose a compromise solution. He would follow the wadi for several hundred meters in the direction that brought him closest to his objective, then climb out and continue overland. The decision cost him precious seconds, but he sensed it would prove worthwhile in the long run. The wadi floor was sandy and relatively easy to navigate, allowing Marcus to maintain a good pace while staying below ground level. After covering what he estimated to be about 400 meters, he found a section where erosion had created a natural ramp leading back to the surface. Emerging from the wadi, Marcus immediately understood why the Israeli training facility had such a fearsome reputation. The landscape ahead was a masterpiece of tactical training design. Natural desert terrain had been enhanced with obstacles and structures that could simulate almost any combat environment. There were urban warfare sections with partially destroyed buildings, open areas with scattered cover that mimicked battlefield conditions, and what appeared to be a complex of underground facilities. More importantly, Marcus could see other figures moving through the training area. Some appeared to be fellow students, but others were clearly instructors or role players participating in various exercises. The realization that multiple training scenarios were running simultaneously added another layer of complexity to his situation. His watch showed that less than 20 minutes remained before sunrise. The extraction point was still approximately 3 kilometers away, and Marcus could no longer hear his immediate pursuers, which somehow made him more nervous than when they had been audibly following him. The next section of terrain required careful navigation through what appeared to be a simulated urban combat zone. Concrete structures rising from the desert floor created a maze of streets and alleys, complete with burned-out vehicles and debris that provided both cover and obstacles. Marcus could hear voices and occasional gunfire from within the complex, indicating that other exercises were in progress. Moving through the urban section, Marcus applied lessons learned during his deployment to Afghanistan, He kept to shadows where possible, moved quickly across open areas, and constantly scanned for threats from multiple directions. The attention to detail in the training facility was remarkable. Even the graffiti on walls looked authentic, and the debris scattered through the streets appeared to be genuine combat damage rather than theatrical props. Halfway through the urban section, Marcus encountered Lieutenant Sarah from the Canadian Armed Forces. She was crouched behind a concrete barrier, breathing heavily and checking her equipment. When she saw Marcus approaching, her expression showed a mixture of relief and concern. "Thank God," she whispered as Marcus took cover beside her. "This place is crawling with instructors playing opposing forces. I've been pinned down here for 10 minutes trying to find a safe route through." Marcus checked his watch again. 15 minutes to sunrise, and they were still more than 2 kilometers from the extraction point. "What's the situation ahead?" "There are at least 6 role players controlling the main route through this section," Sarah replied. "They've got the obvious paths covered, and they're coordinating their movements like a real military unit. I think we're going to have to find an alternative." Looking around the area, Marcus noticed something that Sarah had missed. The urban training section was built on a slight slope, and water erosion had created small channels beneath some of the structures. It wasn't exactly a tunnel system, but it might provide concealed movement through the complex. "Follow me," Marcus said, leading Sarah toward what appeared to be a drainage culvert running beneath the main street. Sometimes the best route is the one nobody expects you to take. The drainage culvert was larger than Marcus had initially estimated, allowing him and Sarah to move through it in a low crouch, rather than crawling on their bellies. The concrete tunnel extended beneath the main street of the urban training complex, and the sound of their boots echoed softly in the enclosed space despite their efforts to move quietly. "This is brilliant," Sarah whispered as they navigated through the tunnel. "I completely missed this option. In Canada, we focus so much on winter warfare and forest environments that urban drainage systems aren't usually part of our tactical thinking." Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on what lay ahead. The tunnel seemed to extend much further than the length of a simple street drainage system, and he was beginning to suspect that the Israeli instructors had created something far more sophisticated than it initially appeared. After several minutes of underground movement, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that was clearly artificial. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on concrete walls, and multiple passages branched off in different directions. This wasn't just a drainage system. It was a full-scale underground training facility designed to simulate the tunnel complexes that Israeli forces sometimes encountered in real combat situations. "We're not just taking a shortcut anymore," Marcus realized, studying the junction where 4 different passages met. "This is another training scenario entirely. They've built an underground combat simulation." Sarah checked her watch, and her expression grew worried. "We've got less than 10 minutes to sunrise, and I have no idea which of these tunnels leads toward the extraction point." Marcus pulled out his compass, but the underground environment made it difficult to get an accurate reading. The Israeli facility designers had clearly thought of everything. Even navigation tools that worked perfectly on the surface became unreliable in the underground complex. The sound of footsteps echoing from one of the tunnels made both soldiers freeze. Someone else was moving through the underground system, and there was no way to determine if they were fellow students, instructors, or role players representing enemy forces. "We need to move," Marcus whispered, choosing the passage that seemed to lead in the most direct line toward their original objective. Standing still in an unknown tactical environment is always the worst option. The tunnel they chose sloped downward at first, then gradually began to rise again. Emergency lighting was spaced at regular intervals, providing just enough illumination to move safely, but not enough to eliminate the psychological pressure of being underground. Marcus found himself impressed once again by the sophistication of the Israeli training facility. After several minutes of movement, they reached another junction, this one with only 2 options. A sign in Hebrew and English indicated that one passage led to Training Area C, while the other led to Emergency, Exit 3. The choice seemed obvious, but Marcus had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too straightforward in this environment. "The emergency exit might be the obvious choice," he said to Sarah, But it might also be monitored or even lead to a different kind of test scenario. Sarah studied both options for a moment. In Canadian military exercises, the obvious choice is wrong about 60% of the time. But sometimes the instructors expect you to overthink the situation, and the obvious choice actually is the correct one. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and Marcus realized they were about to lose the luxury of careful decision-making. Training Area C, he decided, leading Sarah into the left-hand passage. The tunnel began to rise more steeply, and after a few minutes, Marcus could see natural light filtering down from ahead. They were approaching another exit from the underground system, but the light didn't look like the artificial illumination of the training facility. It had the quality of actual sunrise. Emerging from the tunnel, Marcus and Sarah found themselves in a natural depression in the desert landscape, surrounded by low hills that provided concealment from observation. More importantly, Marcus could see a structure about 1 kilometer away that matched the description of their extraction point. "We might actually make it," Sarah said, checking her watch. 5 minutes to sunrise, 1 kilometer to go. That's totally doable if we push hard. But as they began moving toward the extraction point, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach sink. Other figures were also converging on the same location from different directions, and not all of them appeared to be students attempting to reach the extraction point. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see that the extraction point itself was occupied by several figures in military gear. Some appeared to be instructors or support personnel, but others were clearly role players representing enemy forces who controlled the objective area. It's not just about reaching the extraction point, Marcus realized. We have to take it from defending forces. This whole exercise has been leading up to a final combat scenario. Sarah lowered her own binoculars with the expression that mixed exhaustion with determination. I should have expected this. Israeli military doctrine emphasizes that objectives are never just handed to you. They have to be seized and held against opposition. Looking around the area, Marcus could see that they weren't the only students who had reached this final phase of the exercise. Ahmed, the Jordanian soldier, was visible moving carefully along a ridgeline to their left. Hans appeared to be approaching from the opposite direction, using a large outcropping of rocks for concealment. The extraction point itself was a fortified position built around what appeared to be a helicopter landing pad. Concrete barriers provided defensive positions for the role players, and Marcus could see at least 2 crew-served weapons that would make a direct assault extremely difficult. We need to coordinate with the others, Marcus said, studying the tactical situation. 4 individual soldiers attempting separate assaults against a prepared position will fail. But if we can work together. Sarah nodded, already understanding his thinking. Can you signal the others without alerting the defenders? Marcus pulled out a small signal mirror from his kit, a piece of equipment that had seemed almost archaic when it was issued to him. Using reflected sunlight, he began sending simple coded flashes toward Ahmed's position. The Jordanian soldier responded almost immediately, indicating that he understood the need for coordination. Signaling Hans proved more challenging due to his position, but eventually Marcus managed to establish communication with the German soldier as well. Using a combination of hand signals and mirror flashes, they established a basic plan for a coordinated assault on the extraction point. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. According to the original briefing, they had failed to reach the extraction point before sunrise. But Marcus suspected that the real test was just beginning, and that the time limit had been designed to force them into this final scenario, where success would depend on their ability to work together under pressure. Ready? Sarah asked, checking her weapon one final time. Marcus took a deep breath of the clean desert air, feeling more alive and focused than he had in months of ceremonial duties back in London. Let's show them what we've learned. The coordinated attack began at exactly 0630 hours, just as the desert sun cleared the eastern hills completely. Marcus had spent the previous 10 minutes using hand signals to communicate with Ahmed, Hans, and Sarah, establishing a basic but effective assault plan that played to each soldier's apparent strengths. Ahmed, with his extensive desert warfare experience, would approach from the south using natural terrain features for concealment. Hans, whose massive frame and methodical approach suggested he was comfortable with direct action, would create a diversion from the north. Sarah would provide covering fire from an elevated position on the western ridge, while Marcus approached from the east using the morning sun at his back to make himself harder to spot. The plan wasn't sophisticated, but Marcus knew that in combat situations, simple plans executed well often succeeded where complex strategies failed. The key would be timing and coordination, ensuring that all 4 soldiers moved simultaneously to prevent the defenders from concentrating their fire on individual attackers. Marcus began his approach by moving in short rushes between available cover. The terrain leading to the extraction point had been carefully designed to provide just enough concealment to make an assault possible, while still giving defenders clear fields of fire. Every rock outcropping, every slight depression in the ground, had been positioned to create tactical challenges that mimicked real combat environments. As he moved closer to the fortified position, Marcus could see that the role players representing enemy forces were taking their responsibilities seriously. They moved with professional competence, communicated using proper military procedures, and maintained defensive positions with the kind of discipline that came from extensive training. The first phase of the assault began when Hans initiated his diversionary attack from the north. The German soldier's approach was characteristically methodical and overwhelming. He moved from cover to cover with mechanical precision, laying down suppressive fire that forced the defenders to respond to his threat. Almost immediately, Sarah began providing covering fire from her position on the western ridge. Her marksmanship was impressive. Even with training ammunition, she was able to place shots close enough to defending positions to force them to keep their heads down and limit their ability to return effective fire. Ahmed's approach from the south was nearly invisible until he was within 50 meters of the defensive perimeter. His movement through the desert terrain was so smooth and natural that Marcus found himself taking mental notes for future reference. The Jordanian soldier seemed to flow across the landscape like water, using every available piece of cover to mask his approach. Marcus began his own final approach from the east, moving in coordination with his 3 temporary teammates. The morning sun was now high enough to create the backlighting effect he had planned for, making him harder to spot against the bright sky. His Royal Guard training in precision movement served him well as he navigated the final 100 meters to the defensive position. The defenders were professional enough to avoid the mistake of concentrating all their attention on Hans's noisy diversion. Marcus could see that they were tracking multiple threats and preparing to engage targets from all directions. But the coordination between the 4 attacking soldiers was creating exactly the kind of tactical pressure that made effective defense extremely difficult. When Marcus was within 30 meters of the defensive perimeter, everything changed suddenly. Instead of continuing to defend their positions, the role players began a tactical withdrawal toward the helicopter landing pad at the center of the compound. Their movement was professional and coordinated, with covering fire and mutual support that spoke of extensive training. Their withdrawing to a secondary position, Marcus realized, speaking into his radio for the first time since the exercise began. The extraction point itself is the final objective. We need to press the assault before they can establish a strong defensive position there. The 4 international soldiers responded to this development with impressive coordination, considering they had known each other for less than 24 hours and had no opportunity to train together. Ahmed and Hans began bounding forward using fire and movement tactics, while Sarah shifted her position to maintain effective covering fire as the tactical situation evolved. Marcus found himself in the lead as they approached the helicopter landing pad where the defending forces had established their final position behind concrete barriers and metal obstacles. The tactical situation was now completely different from the long-range engagement that had characterized the first phase of the assault. Close-quarters combat required different skills and different thinking. Marcus drew on his experience from urban warfare training and his deployment to Afghanistan, but he also found himself relying on instincts and capabilities that he hadn't known he possessed. The intensity of the situation was bringing out performance levels that exceeded anything he had demonstrated in previous training or combat situations. The final assault on the landing pad began when Ahmed identified a weakness in the defensive position. A drainage ditch that ran alongside the concrete barriers provided a covered approach that the defenders had apparently overlooked. Using hand signals, he communicated this discovery to the other 3 soldiers. Marcus made the tactical decision to lead the final assault personally, moving through the drainage ditch while his 3 teammates provided covering fire and prepared to exploit whatever opportunities his movement might create. The ditch was shallow and provided only minimal cover, but it was enough to allow him to approach within grenade range of the defensive position. What happened next would later be analyzed and discussed by Israeli instructors for months afterward. Instead of using training grenades or attempting to assault the position directly, Marcus did something completely unexpected. He stood up in full view of the defending forces and began walking toward them with his weapon lowered. "Exercise complete," he called out in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the entire training area. "Objective achieved through coordinated international effort. Request permission to approach for debrief." The silence that followed lasted for several seconds that felt like hours. Then, one of the role players began to laugh, and the laughter spread through the entire defensive position. Captain Cohen emerged from behind one of the concrete barriers, her expression showing a mixture of surprise and professional respect. "That," she said, approaching Marcus with her hand extended for a handshake, "is exactly the kind of tactical thinking we were hoping to see. You recognize that the real objective wasn't to destroy the defending force, but to demonstrate your ability to achieve mission success through unconventional approaches." As the other 3 soldiers joined Marcus at the landing pad, all of them breathing heavily from the exertion of the assault, Marcus realized that the entire exercise had been designed to evaluate much more than their individual military capabilities. The Israeli instructors had been testing their ability to adapt, coordinate, and think creatively under extreme pressure. "Phase 1 complete," Captain Cohen announced. "Now we begin Phase 2. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the same briefing room where the exercise had begun, but everything had changed. The 4 international soldiers who had started as strangers were now bound by the shared experience of challenges that had pushed each of them beyond their previous limits. More importantly, the Israeli instructors were looking at them with expressions that Marcus had never seen directed toward visiting soldiers. Captain Cohen stood at the front of the room with a thick folder of evaluation reports, but her demeanor was completely different from the professional courtesy she had shown during their arrival. There was genuine respect in her eyes, and something that looked almost like amazement. "In 15 years of conducting international exchanges," she began, "we have never seen results quite like what you 4 achieved this week. The purpose of these exercises isn't just to test your individual capabilities, though you've all demonstrated exceptional skills. The real test was whether soldiers from different military cultures could adapt to our training methods and exceed their own expectations of what they were capable of achieving." Marcus exchanged glances with Ahmed, Hans, and Sarah. The past 3 days had included challenges that made their initial desert navigation exercise seem like a warm-up. They had faced urban warfare scenarios that required split-second decision-making under fire, underground combat simulations that tested their ability to function in completely unfamiliar environments, and psychological pressure tests that pushed them to their mental breaking points. But more than the individual challenges, it was the way they had learned to function as a unit that had surprised everyone, including themselves. Marcus's Royal Guard precision, Ahmed's desert warfare expertise, Sarah's tactical flexibility, and Hans's methodical thoroughness had combined into something greater than the sum of their parts. "Your performance in the final scenario yesterday was particularly noteworthy," Captain Cohen continued, opening the folder and reviewing several pages of detailed notes. "The hostage rescue simulation in the underground complex was designed to be nearly impossible for a 4-person team with no prior training together. Our own elite units typically require weeks of preparation and rehearsal to achieve the kind of coordination you demonstrated." Marcus remembered the scenario vividly. They had been tasked with infiltrating a multi-level underground facility, neutralizing hostile forces, and extracting 3 civilian hostages without casualties. The complexity had been staggering, with multiple entry points, electronic surveillance, systems, and defending forces that outnumbered them 3-1. What had made their success possible wasn't superior firepower or individual heroics, but something much more subtle. Each soldier had instinctively understood their role within the team dynamic, adapting their natural strengths to complement the others. Marcus had found himself naturally falling into a leadership role, coordinating their movements and making tactical decisions. But unlike his experience in the Royal Guard, where leadership often meant rigid adherence to protocol, this had required constant adaptation and creative problem-solving. The most impressive aspect, Captain Cohen continued, wasn't your tactical execution, though that was exceptional. It was your ability to function as a genuinely integrated unit while maintaining your individual decision-making capabilities. That's a level of military sophistication that we typically see only in our most elite special operations teams. Instructor Levy, the weathered veteran who had briefed them on their first morning, stepped forward with his own folder of evaluation materials. "Thompson," he said, addressing Marcus directly, "your commanding officer in London is going to receive a very interesting report. The transformation we observed in your performance over 5 days suggests capabilities that go far beyond traditional Royal Guard duties." Marcus felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty. The experiences of the past week had shown him aspects of military service that he had never imagined possible. The ceremonial duties and security responsibilities that had defined his career suddenly seemed limiting rather than prestigious. "All 4 of you demonstrated something that we specifically look for in our own soldiers," Instructor Levy continued. "The ability to exceed your previous limitations when the situation demands it. But more than that, you showed the kind of adaptability and creative thinking that modern military operations require." Sarah spoke up for the first time during the CIRI debrief. "Sir, what exactly are you telling us? This feels like more than just a performance evaluation." Captain Cohen exchanged glances with Instructor Levy, and Marcus caught the subtle communication that passed between them. Something was happening here that went beyond the standard international exchange program. "The Israeli Defense Forces has a problem," Captain Cohen said after a moment of consideration. "We're facing security challenges that require new approaches and fresh perspectives. Traditional military training, no matter how excellent, sometimes produces predictable responses to unpredictable threats." She walked to the wall map that showed the training facility, but Marcus noticed that it also showed locations throughout Israel and neighboring regions that had not been part of their exercises. "We're developing a new program," Captain Cohen continued, "designed to create small, highly adaptable teams that can operate independently in complex environments. Teams that combine the best elements of different military cultures and training philosophies." Ahmed leaned forward in his chair, clearly understanding the implications before Marcus fully grasped them. "You're offering us positions in this program." "We're offering you the opportunity to help create this program," Instructor Levy corrected. "Your performance this week demonstrated that the concept can work, but developing it into a functional capability will require months of additional training and experimentation." Marcus felt his world shifting in ways he couldn't fully process. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been preparing for the next ceremonial parade. Now he was being offered the chance to participate in developing entirely new approaches to military operations. "What would this mean for our existing service obligations?" Hans asked, speaking for the first time in his heavily accented but precise English. "That would be negotiated between governments," Captain Cohen replied. "But I can tell you that several allied nations have already expressed interest in this program. The modern security environment requires new forms of international cooperation." Marcus thought about Emma, his fiancée waiting for him in London. He thought about his comfortable position in the Royal Guard, with its predictable duties and clear career progression. Then he thought about the past 5 days, and the feeling of discovering capabilities he had never known he possessed. "How long do we have to decide?" he asked. "Take whatever time you need," Captain Cohen replied. "But I hope you'll consider that opportunities like this don't come along often. You've proven that you can exceed your own limitations. The question is whether you want to continue growing or return to what you were doing before." As Marcus left the briefing room with the other 3 soldiers, he realized that regardless of what decision he ultimately made, he would never be quite the same person who had arrived at the Israeli training facility 5 days earlier. The elite royal guard who had accepted this challenge had discovered that he was capable of far more than he had ever imagined. The question now was what he was going to do with that knowledge. Walking into the desert sunset with 3 soldiers, who had become genuine friends and teammates, Marcus knew that the most important decision of his military career was still ahead of him. But for the first time in years, he felt truly excited about what the future might hold.